this module we're going to be looking at sampling, and how you can use devices such as Reason's NN-19 to create your own unique instrument. But first a bit about sampling itself. Sampling is a musical technique that began in the 80s, and is now one of the most widespread elements of modern music, particularly mainstream music. It's my opinion that sampling came about to introduce more familiar sounds to the largely alien genre of electronic music. Extracts would be taken from existing songs, particularly funk and soul, and then mixed with beats and bass lines to create an original track. Old hardware samplers worked like hard disk recorders, where you played audio into them from vinyl or a CD to record the bit that you wanted. You'd then trim the start and end of the recorded extract to get it exactly right. And you'd then map that sample to a keyboard key so that you could play it when the key was pressed, or get a computer's MIDI sequencer to play it for you. Sampling is the technology often used to create drums, as we've already seen, taking a load of individual drum samples and mapping them to the slots in a drum sampler to construct a beat. And sampling is also the method used for recreating the sound of an instrument. For example, you could record all of the notes on a piano and then map those samples to the same notes on a MIDI keyboard. This is one way of creating a more natural emulation of that piano. We've already looked at how to load different sounds into NN-19 earlier in the course, so let's check out what's actually happening when we do this. I've loaded up a piano patch called Bright Piano, which I can play now by sending MIDI notes to NN-19. This patch is a multi-sampled one, meaning that there are lots of samples loaded into NN-19, and the one you trigger depends on the key you press. The most realistic piano patch would obviously be created by having a different sample on every key to match the piano that was recorded. However, this is rarely the case, and more often there are samples taken at regular intervals across the MIDI note range, and then each one is spanned to a few keys. The large display in the centre of the front panel shows you the samples that are currently loaded into NN-19 and where they are mapped, and allows you to perform some basic editing. Rotating the sample dial scrolls through all of the samples, as you can see, with the name changing above. There are 20 different samples in the patch, which are basically 4 different notes from one octave: C, D sharp, F sharp, and A, sampled at 5 different pitches, from octave 1 to octave 5. These samples are then mapped into key zones across the keyboard, which I can see if I click on the strip on the display here. So, if I click on this zone, then you can see the sample that's mapped to it is piano BC4 WAV, which is a sample of the note C3. And it's mapped from one note below to one note above. So playing C sharp 3 triggers the same sample as playing C3, only it's transposed up a semitone. If I click on the next zone along, then you can see the sample is piano B D sharp 4, and this is mapped from D3 to E3, so the next 3 keys up. You can hear this most obviously if I slowly play descending semitones. The sample clearly changes every 3 notes. Although this sounds obvious when played like this, it's not so obvious when you play the instrument like a normal piano, so it produces a good emulation. We're not going to continue looking at multi-sampling right now though, as this is covered on the advanced course. What we're going to look at instead is single sampling, and how you can create your own bass patch using an audio file you might find in a sample pack. The way we'll start to do this is to empty NN-19 of samples. This is done by opening up the context menu on the display and choosing Initialize Patch. Now the instrument has no samples, and you're free to load your own. This is done using the browser switch above, which allows you to select any WAV, IF, Rex slices, or various other formats to load. I'm browsing to my samples folder and choosing a bass stab from the Loopmaster's Fidget House sample pack. This one is just a brief sustained note, so it's good for playing with and making my own. Unlike with the samples in the multi-sampled instrument, this sample is automatically mapped to the entire keyboard, so now playing any note will trigger that sample. You can hear if I play keys that are much higher up, that the sample also gets shorter as the pitch rises. This is because the sample is transposed by being sped up, which increases its pitch and length. This is something to consider when you're creating timed effects with sampled sounds, as we'll see later on in the course. Firstly though, if we want to create a melodic phrase with this sound, then the best thing to do is to tune the sample. Tuning can be done with the controls in the oscillator section on the right. There are 3 dials. One transposes the sound up and down in octaves, one in semitones, and one in fractions of a semitone. However, the easiest way of tuning this sample is to change its root key, so it matches that of the actual sample. As we know that this bass stab is in F from the name, we just need to make sure that the sample played back at its original pitch is on a key of F. The keyboard key that triggers the original untransposed sample is called the root key, and you can change it using the root dial once the sample is selected on the display. As default, this is C3, so I just need to change this to an F. If I play a key of F3 repeatedly whilst rotating the root dial, you'll hear the sample shifting until, when set to F3, the original sample will be played. Once set to F3, playing any key on the keyboard will play the same pitch as the MIDI note being played. The next thing we might want to do is to set up a loop. You can hear at the moment that playing a key makes the sample play through once and then stop. What we can do instead is make the sample repeat. If I rotate the loop dial, you can see there are 2 options, forwards and forwards backwards. The first makes the sample play through forwards over and over, so when it reaches the end, it jumps back to the start. And the second makes the sample play forwards, then backwards repeatedly, so when it gets to the end, it plays backwards to the start. Often the second option makes a smoother sound, but in this case it seems to work better with the first. The only problem is that we can't change the loop size here, so at the moment it's looping the entire sample. If we want to change the loop size, then we need to open the sample edit window. This is done by bringing up the context menu on the display and choosing Edit Sample. Now you can see the whole sample here, and can change the start and end, or loop bracket, accordingly. Like in the sequencer, you can change the zoom settings using the navigator at the bottom, by dragging the edges of the blue rectangle in the same way. You can see that this bass sound is an identical waveform repeated over and over, with a slight fade in at the start. So the best thing to do if wanting to set up a loop is to have the loop start after the fade in and at a point where the waveform intersects the line running through the middle, which is when the signal is silent. The loop bracket is set using the left and right markers as in the sequencer, only there's no snap mode here, so I can just drag the L to wherever I want, or I can use the keyboard shortcut of holding down the Option key and then clicking on the ruler. Now I can position the right marker to set the end of the loop, making sure it's at a point where the waveform ends, so just after the downward slope. If I play the sample, which you do by hitting play or using the spacebar, then you can hear it doesn't matter where I put the right bracket, after 1 cycle, 2 cycles, or more, as the sample is a repeated waveform anyway, so the loop ends up sounding the same. A faster way of setting the sample's start and end, or loop bracket in this window, is to select a portion of the waveform by clicking and dragging on it with the mouse, and then using the 2 switches below. Now that we've got our loop worked out then, we can rename it Looped, and then hit Save. Now we've got a sustained note with no clicks or rising and falling in level, which plays at the correct pitch when we play MIDI notes. So we're ready to start editing the sample using the controls on the front panel. I'm sure they all look quite intimidating to you at this stage, as there are so many. But you'll see as we work through this module, and the next, that they are very similar to the controls you find on a lot of instruments, and you should also find you're familiar with some of them already. We're going to start by looking at the amplitude envelope. This controls the level of the sample over time. We started to look at envelopes a couple of modules ago, when we learned about envelope modulation of filters. Well, this is even easier, as it's just modulating the volume. Firstly, we set the overall level of the signal using the level slider. Then, the 4 envelope sliders alongside set how this value behaves when a key is pressed. This is a full ADSR envelope. We've seen the first 2 sliders, attack and decay, already on the course, but we've not really looked at the next 2 yet. These are sustain and release. At the moment, the sustain level is set to max, so it's just sustaining, which makes it full level all of the time. If we turn all the sliders down, then you won't hear anything. So the sustain slider works like a second level slider. With sustain turned down, we can use the first 2 sliders to set a rise and fall in level. For example, increasing the attack time sets the amount of time it takes the signal to rise to full level, creating a fade-in. You can hear that, with the sustain set to 0, the level suddenly cuts after the maximum is reached. If you would rather the signal continued at full level after the fade-in, then you need to set the sustain back to max. Or, as an alternative, you can have a decay instead, which makes the level fade out after the attack time has passed. The bigger the decay, the longer the fade out. So, with an attack and a decay, we're getting the signal fading in and out. With a bass sound, we probably don't want much of a fade-in, as we want the sound to be nice and punchy. So we want it to go to full level straight away, or very quickly, which we can achieve by setting the attack slider to a very low level, or the very bottom. With no attack, the level goes straight to maximum, and then fades out for a length of time set by the decay slider. The release slider sets how long the sound takes to fade out when a key is released. So at the moment, with no release, the sound cuts out straight away if I stop holding down a key during the attack and decay phase. Increasing the release time now allows you to create a fade out, which becomes longer the higher you set the release. Now let's look at what happens to the sound when I add a filter to it. Hopefully you're getting used to filters now, and have a bit more of an understanding of what they do to an audio signal. The filter controls on NN-19 are identical to those we saw on Rex. You've got all the different types that you can choose with the mode switch, and then sliders for frequency and resonance, and then all of the envelope parameters. Typically with a bass sound, you want to use a low-pass filter, unless you're removing very low frequencies from the bottom, when you'd use a high pass. With a low pass filter then, I can use the frequency control to cut the high frequencies, in increasing amounts as I bring the slider down. So, with a low cutoff, the sound becomes subtler because you're only left with the lowest bass frequencies. A good thing to do when filtering a bass though is to add some envelope modulation to the filter, so that the high frequencies can be reintroduced at certain points in time, just like when we applied the envelope modulated filter to the drums in Dr. Rex at the end of Module 6. If you remember, every time the drums hit, the cutoff of the low-pass filter raised by an amount set by the amount slider and with a speed according to the attack and decay sliders. Well, it's exactly the same here. So, with the frequency slider down low, you can hear that the filter has removed the high frequencies. But when I turn up the amount dial next to the envelope sliders, which increases the amount of modulation applied to the frequency slider, then you can hear the high frequencies are brought back in now when I play a key. What's happening there then is the frequency slider is literally jumping up to the top when a key is pressed, and then sliding back down to the position set. You just can't see it happening. The way the frequency slider is modulated by the envelope sliders is identical to the effect they had on the level in the amp section we just looked at. So if I turn them all down, then you can hear that the sustain slider is like a second frequency slider, where, as long as the amount dial is turned up to max, it controls the cutoff of the filter. However, it only controls the cutoff amount when a note is held down. And when I let go, you can hear that the filter cutoff drops immediately back down to the value set by the frequency slider. If we turn that down, let's have a listen to the attack now. This slider sets the amount of time for the cutoff to modulate up to the maximum before it drops to the sustain level. This upward filter slide creates a wah sound as the filter opens. The length of the wah depends on the attack duration. The decay slider sets the amount of time it takes for the cutoff modulation to drop to the sustain level. So, with no attack and no sustain, the cutoff jumps up straight away and then slides down to the frequency slider value. This downward filter slide creates an ow sound as the filter closes. Remember that the decay slider only has an effect if the sustain slider isn't set to max. Having a decay on its own is good if you want a high impact bass sound, which has the highest level and frequency at the very start. But I quite like to have an attack and decay, so you get a filter slide up and down. The last slider, release, sets the amount of time the cutoff takes to modulate back down after you release a key. At the moment you can hear if I press and release a key before the attack and decay are finished, the cutoff just jumps straight down. If I increase the release time now, you get a gradual slide back down instead, which creates a smoother effect. Of course, this slider only has an effect when the release slider in the amplitude envelope section is turned up. Otherwise, the sound would just cut as soon as I released a key, so the filtering wouldn't be heard. So make sure you have that turned up if wanting to add a filter release effect. I've programmed a little drum and bass clip for our bass patch now, and added one of the Hospital Records loops from the New Tone Loopmasters sample pack, which is playing in Rex. The bass line is a classic Ronnie Size one, which is good for demonstrating the filter envelope's effect. It's all about the attack really, as this creates the upward filter slide for that classic mwop mwop sound. The length of the attack is really important, as it doesn't just change the character of the bass, but changes its timing as well. Lengthening the attack makes the higher frequencies get introduced later, which makes the bass line lazier. You can hear that with no attack it doesn't work nearly as well, as the timing sounds too rigid. Have a play around with that bass line and all of the filter envelope parameters so you can hear the different effects they make. And maybe construct a bass line of your own using the bass patch. The last thing I want to show you on NN-19 is how you can use the software's one-click sampling facility to create your own samples. This reminds me of the good old days of sampling, or at least the old days, as it was pretty tedious back then compared to now. The facility is available on all of Reason's samplers, so NN-19, NN-XT, Redrum and Kong, and allows you to sample from an MP3 or vinyl, or record your own vocal or instrument sample. I'm going to show you how to record a vocal sample. So I've connected a microphone to input 1 on my Sapphire and turned on phantom power. The two inputs on Sapphire are the left and right channels that get sampled as default. So the first thing to do is to change it so that we're just sampling input 1, so recording in mono and not stereo. This is done on the hardware interface at the top. I'm not looking at patching too much on the Level 1 course, but just so you know how to do this, the sampling inputs are here on the hardware interface, and the signal being sent to them is the two audio inputs coming in to record. So we just need to get rid of the right channel by clicking and dragging it away. Now, only input 1 from my Sapphire is being sampled. If I wanted to record input 2 instead, then I just move the cable like so. Then, if you want to check levels, you can make some noise into your mic and observe the meters for audio input and sampling input 1. And if it's clipping, then turn down the gain dial on the interface. Now to sample a vocal sound, I just hit the start sampling switch, which then starts recording. Then once I've recorded in enough sounds, I just hit the stop switch and recording will stop.
Yeah. Oh. Oh.
Now, when I hit a C3 key on my keyboard, you can hear the whole recorded sample plays back.
Yeah. Oh. Oh.
If I want to edit this to trim the sample, I just choose Edit Sample from the context menu like we did before. Only this time, I'm going to move the start and end positions without activating loop. The best way of hearing what you're doing here is to play a MIDI note on your keyboard, rather than use the play facility in this window.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, oh. Oh, oh, oh.
Then, when you're happy, you can just click Save and rename it if you want. Then you can play the sample like an instrument, where its pitch goes up and down when you play higher or lower MIDI notes.
Oh, 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 oh.
Hopefully now you understand the basic principles of sampling, some of the controls you find on a sampler, and how to edit those parameters to create different effects. Before the next module, try to create some samples of your own, from whatever source you like. If you have any questions, then you can contact me on support@reasoncourses.com or by going to the Producer Tech forum. Next time we're going to be looking at synthesizing and introducing you to the concept of creating sounds from scratch. See you then.